Wonderful. Here we are. We're just going to wait a couple of seconds for everyone else to join. I can see that people are trickling in, but I can go over some housekeeping rules as we wait for everyone else to join. So first of all, everyone should be on mute by default. I'm not sure if you have the option to unmute. I don't think you should have it. If you do happen to have it, please don't use it. If you have any questions, just pop them directly into the chat. We're not going to use the polls functionality simply because chat is much easier and quicker. Cool. Given that we are 2 minutes behind schedule, I'm just going to kick it off straight away. Before we actually dive into the topic, I wanted to quickly introduce the audience so that all of you know who else is dialed in alongside you. So we have a very diverse audience on, I would say, 2 out of 3 dimensions. First of all, it's geographically very diverse. We have people dialing in from all parts of the world. Obviously, many European countries are heavily represented, but we also have people dialing in from as far as the Philippines, I think, and we have some really brave ones dialing in from the US. I would say you are absolute troopers for dialing in at this time. Even if you're on the East Coast, it's still very early. So thank you for joining us. In terms of company backgrounds, it's also a very diverse audience here because we have people who join us from the entire spectrum. We have people who work at startups that are relatively early stage. We have quite a lot of people joining us from scale-ups. And we also have many people that work at very large public tech companies, including, I think, 2 people from FANGs. So that's really interesting. So it means that this is very top of mind, I guess, for people regardless of the size or maturity of the organization. And then the last dimension is gender diversity. So ironically, it is not a very diverse audience. It's about 80% female and 20% male. I would say that's emblematic, though, of people teams around the world. And I would say kudos to people teams for pushing up the average representation, which is something that we will talk about a bit later in this chat today. Great. So let's dive into our topic. So obviously, pay equity is the name of the game here. If we go back to what this actually means, right? So pay equity stands for the principle of same pay for the same work. So people who perform work of equal value should receive equal or the same pay. That is a principle that is kind of enshrined in national law in almost every single country around the world. But as we know, in reality, things look a little bit different. And that's what we're here to talk about and unpick a little bit. So we have kind of 2 parts of today's webinar. In the first part, we will look at the data to really look at, okay, what are the symptoms of the underlying problems? Then we will jump into the fireside chat, where we will go a little bit into the hypotheses as to what might be contributing to these symptoms that we can see. And we want to get as practical as possible by sharing some examples of things that companies can do in order to address this. And if we are successful, then I hope that each of you who is joining us today to listen in is going to take away maybe a few ideas for things they can try at their organization. And maybe you will also have heard things that have been tried in the past but didn't really work that well, which can also be quite a valuable learning. So with that in mind, let me quickly jump to our next slide where I introduce our panel. So I'm going to start from right to left. We have Emma Baker joining us. Emma is the head of people operations and reward at Zoopla. If you live in the UK, you definitely know Zoopla and you probably will have used it as well. If you are not familiar with Zoopla, it is one of the UK's leading real estate marketplaces. Emma also worked at Just Eat for a very long time in senior positions before joining Zoopla. And I'll get to that in a second and you'll see why. We also have our very own Vaso joining us. She's Ravio's Chief People Officer. Vaso has been with the company for 2 years. She actually took a big leap of faith in joining this company when it was still a pre-product startup, for which I will be forever grateful. And she made that leap when she was VP of People at TrueLayer, which is a very large UK-based fintech. Before TrueLayer, Vaso was also Chief People Officer at CarWow, and she also worked at Deliveroo. And you can see where I'm going. I'm going to introduce myself. I'm the co-founder and co-CEO at Ravio. You can see that we like to be quite egalitarian here. Lots of co's going on. Before starting Ravio in 2022, I worked at Deliveroo, where I overlapped with Vaso. Both of us actually were quite early in Deliveroo. Now, I'm probably the only non-people person in this entire chat, including the audience. So I feel a slight imposter syndrome here. But you can see where Vaso and I actually come from. We worked at a company that was trying to disrupt Just Eat's business, especially in the UK. So I would say, Emma, big thank you from both of us for putting aside past rivalries and joining us here for today's panel. Great. So let's jump into the data. So what I wanted to do here is shed some light on where the data actually comes from. So those of you who are not super familiar with Ravio, we are a compensation benchmarking platform. And the way we work is that we connect directly to the HR systems of our customers, which means that we get access to market data as it evolves in real time. And at this stage, we are in more than 1,000 companies, and we have over 300,000 data points in our data set. Each data point represents one employee, which means that we can actually draw many insights from that data. And you can see, kind of get a flavor of where that data comes from. It comes from companies across the spectrum, mostly European-based startups and scale-ups, including some very large names, but also everything from very early stage startup through scale-up. So we cover the entire spectrum. And we recently released a pay equity report where we looked at the gender pay gap. Now, we focused entirely on male versus female gender pay gap. We didn't look into any other pay gaps simply because there's just not enough data to reach any statistical significance, but we will do that in the future. But that gives you a sense of where this data comes from. So it's very timely and accurate data that is 100% employer reported. Before we actually go into the results of our findings, I think it will be helpful to take a step back and explain the concepts behind two key metrics that we will be leaning on in today's chat. Most of you will be familiar with these terms, so apologies if this is a repetition, but some of you might not. So I thought I'd just quickly explain what we mean. So we have two metrics, the adjusted and the unadjusted pay gap. The unadjusted pay gap is very much a crude metric, which just looks at the median earnings of women compared to the median earnings of men. The reason why this is crude is because it leads to a not like-for-like comparison. And we can see that in a second in an illustration. But effectively, median just means that you sort numbers from the smallest to the largest, and you just pick the middle value. Right? So obviously, if you're comparing two data sets, one of which skews more towards, say, higher numbers, and one of which skews towards smaller numbers because people just earn less in that cohort, you are going to get a very big pay gap, but it doesn't actually mean that you're comparing people who perform jobs of equal value in terms of the value they contribute to the organization. And that is why we also look at the adjusted pay gap, which controls for these factors and provides more of a like-for-like comparison of people who perform jobs of equal value, and it looks at the pay difference between the two. So this is the illustration I was talking about. Before I go into the numbers, if you just take a look at the illustration in the middle of this chart, you can see at the top, we kind of made up a data set of 10 men, and at the bottom, there are 10 women. And you can see, based on the classification of these two groups, that there are actually more men in higher level positions at the exec level and at the manager level compared to women, whereas women skew more towards junior roles. This is not made up. This is the reality, and we'll talk about this in the data in a bit. But this kind of illustrates the point of why just drawing a simple unadjusted median doesn't really allow us to draw that many conclusions from the comparison, because here, we're comparing a more junior level professional woman with a more senior professional level man, and that leads to quite a big pay gap. In Europe, in fact, this is a 25% pay gap, which means that women earn 25% less than men if looked at on an unadjusted basis. So it's quite a high number, and this is usually the headline metric that most news organizations would lead with, which might make you believe that women earn 25% less for performing work of the same value. That is not the case. The reality is a bit better, but the sad truth is that there is still a pay gap. And we can see that here when we look at the adjusted pay gap. So here we're looking at the adjusted pay gap across the European tech ecosystem. Now we have controlled for factors such as country, job position, as well as job level. And job level is probably one of the best proxies you will ever find for how organizations think about value that a job contributes to the organization. So in this case, we took that as a proxy to adjust for the pay gap, and you can see that the median reduces from 25% to 2.5%. So that means that for performing work of the same value, same job, same country, women earn 2.5% less across the European tech ecosystem. Now, this is by no means a perfect measure either, because it can mask outliers in certain departments or certain countries. So what we see when we look at our data is that, for example, in engineering, there is still a very high adjusted pay gap between men and women. And in other professions, that is also true. For example, in finance, it's also quite high. But that gets masked when looking at the aggregate number, which kind of just looks at the average. So what does this look like? Sorry, actually, before I jump to the next slide, this is the European average. Now, in a second, we'll dive into country level details. And we can see that there's a huge variance here among European countries. But before we go into that, there is one more thing that is really important to address, which is the issue of what we call representation. So one of the reasons why there's such a big difference between the unadjusted and the adjusted pay gap is because of representation. If we look at the data for Europe, you can actually see here on the left, I'm not sure if you can see my mouse, but the left chart shows that there are far fewer women working in the European tech industry than men. So it's about 40% women and 60% men. Now, when you compare that with general demographics and employment statistics, it's a unreasonably high gap. So it's way above the market, right? In Europe, I think we have about 51% of the population female, 49% male, and then the male employment rate is about 80%. The female employment rate is 70%. So when you adjust for that, there's roughly a 15% difference between women and men in employment. If we look at the difference in technology, it's a 50% delta, right? So from 40% to 60%. So that is way above what the overall non-tech market looks like. So that is an indication that maybe the tech industry has some sort of an issue. Could be an issue at the source, could be an issue in progression, and we'll talk about that in our fireside chat. But that is the first representation issue that the industry faces. The second one, which is even more pronounced, is the lack of female representation in senior roles. So in this case, we've boiled it down to executive roles. According to our framework, executive roles is everything from VP and above, so VP, SVP, and C-level. And when you look at the mix of men and women in that segment, it is shocking, right? You can see that here in the chart on the right-hand side. Only 20% of executive roles are held by women compared to almost 80% that are held by men. So since this gap is much bigger than the overall gap for the entire population, this means that something is not working. And this is actually what we want to really spend our time unpicking in the course of the conversation with Emma and Vaso. Before we start the fireside chat, though, let's quickly have a look at some of the main European markets. I hope that this is large enough for all of you to see. Don't get overwhelmed by the illustration. I'll walk you through it piece by piece. So first of all, you can see that we have picked 6 countries here: the UK, Germany, Sweden, France, Netherlands, and Spain. These are the main tech markets in Europe for which we hold large amounts of data. And you can see this large bar chart here, which shows the unadjusted pay gap, which I just talked about previously. Then you can see a small pink section in the middle. The pink section shows the adjusted pay gap. So this would be the like-for-like comparison between jobs. And then you can see two bubbles. The dark bubble, which for the UK is at 27%, shows the proportion of women that are in senior positions. And the shaded bubble shows the proportion of men that are in senior positions. So let's walk through what the numbers actually say. So first of all, leading the pack from behind is Spain, with the highest unadjusted pay gap at 35%, as well as the highest adjusted pay gap of 6.3%. So what these numbers tell us is that two people, a man and a woman, performing work of the same value in the Spanish tech ecosystem have a pay gap of 6.3%, so women earn 6.3% less than men for doing the same work. We can also see here that Spain has the lowest proportion of women in senior positions at 11%, but also a relatively low proportion of men in senior positions at 25%. But what's important here to understand is the comparison of men and women that are senior. So in this case, it's a factor of over 2x, and that explains also why Spain has such a huge unadjusted pay gap. Now, let's go up. So we can see, the Netherlands faring slightly better, actually has a much lower adjusted and unadjusted pay gap, and a much higher proportion of women in senior positions, as well as men. And then as we go towards the top of our chart, the numbers tend to get better. Now, interestingly, I think Sweden is one to call out because the Nordics are praised for having many policies at the country level that are national law that force companies to really pay attention to pay equity issues. And if you look at the unadjusted pay gap, Sweden is actually the best country here at only 16%. When you look at the adjusted pay gap, though, suddenly that number stands at 3.4%, which is still much higher than Germany and the UK, which don't have that many policies around pay equity. So that was an interesting finding for us. We dove a little bit into the numbers, but it's really hard to ultimately understand the exact root cause on a country-by-country basis. But we have some hypotheses that potentially we can touch upon in the next few minutes. And then finally, going up, Germany and UK have a very similar adjusted pay gap, standing at 1.6% and 1.4% respectively. But especially the UK is actually the second quote-unquote worst country when it comes to the unadjusted pay gap, 31%. And the reason behind that is that there is a much higher proportion of men in senior positions compared to women. And this is kind of ironic, right? Because if you look at the proportion of women in senior positions in isolation compared to all the other European countries, you would assume that the UK will have a lower unadjusted pay gap. That is not the case, and it's because a very high proportion of men in the UK tech industry in particular are actually working in very senior positions. So that is a bit the lay of the land of where we stand from a pay equity perspective in Europe. Obviously, there's much more detail to this. This is just a very high-level analysis. If you're interested in a more detailed breakdown, also looking at the differences by job function, you will find those in our pay equity report, which you can find on our website. But I think for the purpose of this conversation, that really sets the scene quite nicely to talk about, what are the contributing factors and what can companies do to address these issues, which are clearly still there. So, with that being said, I wanted to segue straight into our fireside chat. We actually have two questions that we want to analyze a little bit. The first one is the representation issue in general, why there's so few women in European tech. And the second part is more focused on why there's so few senior women in European tech. And for that, I'm going to actually hand it over to Vaso and Emma. And the first question goes to Vaso. So Vaso, open-ended question. Why are there so few women in European tech?
Yeah, thanks, Martin, and thanks for talking us through all the interesting numbers and slides. Yeah, I kind of feel that we're caught in sort of a vicious cycle, and it's unclear to me what comes first. But I think if I had to zone in on, the one thing that makes a critical difference, it's in order to encourage women to apply and work in tech, representation at the very top matters. So the lack of female role models in tech is what in itself is keeping women out of applying into roles in tech. And then if I think about why that might be happening, and some of the insight that came out from our report is, the perception or the societal perception, I suppose, that tech is predominantly a male space. There'll be tons of men who work in that company. I might not belong. That kind of thinking, together with again a lack of female role models at the top. And I mean, certainly, I've very often interviewed at companies where the entire hiring panel was very senior men who might have been great allies and fantastic guys, but certainly helped perpetuate the sort of myth that, yeah, maybe tech is predominantly a male space, and will I struggle to work here and be effective? I think so that in itself influences the top of the hiring funnel. And I think, Emma, you had some thoughts when we chatted about this earlier.
Yeah, I do. So thank you for taking us through that to this point. I think similarly, where there is a lack of senior role models in the tech space, I think why we have tried to focus our attention is on candidate pipeline. So looking at initiatives with Text You Can, for example, where you can really focus on the learning, the opportunities that young women will receive in schools. So really understanding kind of how that journey into tech would be supported from that. Diverse kind of panels when it comes to hiring, when they are actually coming through that interview process. And then equally looking at opportunities when people join, and women join the business in things like, having a real focus on apprenticeship programs for our engineering cohort within the business. So again, trying to get the pipeline so that you can develop and then retain that cohort of apprentices into more senior roles. And, we've been fairly successful in that. We could be doing more, but they were the main focuses that we were trying to work on to get more senior women into our tech roles. And then once people are in those more senior roles, and it is smaller numbers, we've put some plans in place around development and kind of women in leadership programs to really support them there.
Yeah, thanks, Emma. And I just to add one more point that popped into my mind. It's important to constantly be measuring, what's coming into the hiring funnel. So, in a previous organization, we were able to identify that actually women converted much better than men further down the funnel. The problem was that for every I think it was something like 14 for every 14 men that we were attracting through our job ads and through our recruitment initiatives, we were seeing only one woman come into the funnel. So that was really helpful because immediately we understood, okay, we need to have a much more targeted top of funnel campaign for the next 6 months to a year to make sure that our name, our brand gets out there as a great place for women to apply to and hopefully stay for a while. And that was quite effective for us.
I actually had a question for both of you, which is related to getting buy-in for pay equity in the first place. And I've witnessed many conversations myself where people look at the data and they acknowledge the fact, like, yes, we have a very male-dominated workforce, but they don't necessarily see it as an issue. And by the way, this is not just men saying that. I've also heard a few women saying that. And if those people happen to be in the critical leadership positions, I imagine it's very hard to bring about any change, because without buy-in, you're not going to get the resources needed in order to actually get things done. So I was wondering whether you have any practical advice for people in the audience of how to go about generating that awareness and buy-in and understanding in the first place.
Yeah, Can you hear me? Sorry. Yeah, I'm happy to talk about this. So I completely agree, Martin. I think buy-in from the senior teams and buy-in from males, females across the business is super important. I think where we have found challenges before is, I think the business feels this is a people team function-led initiative, but actually you need the whole business to be brought into it. You need hiring managers. You need managers that are, have got bigger teams that are going through the promotion process more often than the smaller teams. You've got managers that, or individuals that really need to kind of have a voice around it. And something we've practically done is we've created a network, so an impact network, and we've got an exec sponsor that sits within that network that really helps, galvanize that team, look at the initiatives that we can put in place around, it could be, a whole host of things around the data for the gender pay gap, around pay equity, around our policies and processes that we have in place to ensure that they're diverse, ensure that there is an understanding from a hiring perspective. So there's a number of initiatives, but I think the two key things is enabling that voice and that communication, and ensuring that there's a senior person that's sponsoring that, and is actually very, very supportive of it as well.
Yeah, totally agree, Emma, and love the impact network. I would just add to, as much as possible, try and think tactically. If your CEO or whoever it is that that you need to influence or is not influenceable on this pay equity subject. So think tactically. What is front of mind for them? Is it we're not hiring fast enough, we're not hiring well enough, talent density, retention? What is it that's front of mind? And solve for how pay equity will help that. And it is something that you sort of don't feel the pain of until you feel the pain. So getting proactively in front of any inconsistencies or unfairness that you have, and solving that problem as early as possible, will mean that further down the line, you don't get this distraction and noise and politics that inevitably come out of inconsistencies in pay.
And does it have you seen kind of a need to prepare a proper business case with some numbers? So speaking the language of many senior executive teams?
For sure. I mean, anything that is not debatable and sort of there in the cold, hard light of day is really, really helpful.
But maybe to dig in on that, right? Because it sounds very simple on the surface, but I'm sure it is actually quite complicated to prepare a proper business case that quantifies the negative implication of having a big gender imbalance inside an organization. So I don't know if either of you have any practical advice here for our audience, but I think it would be really interesting to dive into that if possible.
Yeah, I mean, I think, starting with, it's the right thing to do, to sort of put the anecdotal sort of bit at the top of the business case, helps. Tying into any data that one might have from like exit interviews that have brought inequities in pay, up as a central theme as well, or any data, even if it is anecdotal, from manager conversations that we can then tie into trends that we're seeing amongst the employee cohort. Especially when they can be connected with performance data, etc. That can really be really powerful in putting across the story that you need to tell.
Yeah, and I think just to build slightly on that, Vasu, I think data is key. I think the data that you can present at any point, and what we moved to was regular reporting. So instead of moving away from a yearly update, a half yearly update, we have a standing slide on our exec summary that talks about gender pay, that talks about our gender split across the business. So it's at the forefront of the discussions. We are, when we're talking about hiring, we're talking about diverse pipelines, and we're trying to be really focused on the key points that we think we can have an impact. Again, looking at our exit survey, looking at our engagement survey, looking at our performance review feedback, our promotion, and also at any point looking at any of our processes and looking at the data that sits on the back of them, ensuring that when we have a promotion panel, that it's an equal split, or it's based, and we look at that data at the back of it, and always have a retro to ensure that we're consistently measuring our data accurately.
And then I have one more question on this subject before we move on to understanding why there might be so few senior women in the tech industry. So my question is, especially in the 2020s, 2021s, post-COVID, when everyone was trying to hoover up as much talent as possible in the market, and probably most CEOs were obsessed with their team's not hiring fast enough or losing candidates to a competitor. How do you uphold the principle of pay equity in an environment like that, where I assume that from the business side, there is a high likelihood that people will say, let's just bend the rules for this one candidate. It's the best candidate in the market. We really need to close this role. It can deliver huge business impact, knowing that there will be a negative implication on the overall either gender imbalance or the gender pay gap. Like, how do you make sure that you balance those two objectives? One is what the business needs in order to be successful in the short term, and what the business needs in order to be successful in the long term, which comes from a balanced and equally paid workforce.
Yeah, I can go first. First, let me start with, I think what I think is the realistic answer, in that it will never be perfect. And sadly, there are times when, a business will think, okay, here we need to make an exception, and here's why. So I think being transparent that sometimes, and it should be rarely, there may be a business need that is significant enough to warrant an exclusion to the principles. And by the way, here are the principles by which we very rarely think that an exception may be made. Now, I do think that where a role or a critical hire doesn't fit the exception principles, it isn't worth the amount of sort of operational complexity that comes further down the road to amend any mistakes or inconsistencies. It's not worth the sort of noise that comes further down the line, especially where there are big spreads between roles of the equal responsibilities and equal value. A reasonable range, of course, as we see in, for example, a salary band makes sense. But anything that sort of would, you would feel embarrassed and ashamed to show to the entire employee population. Usually, if you can't justify that based on your principles, my advice is, don't do it. It's not worth it.
So basically what you're saying is you need to have your regular decision-making framework, which is typically your bands, but then you also need to develop a framework for exceptions instead of, going on a case-by-case basis and just saying finger in the air, whoever shouts loudest wins.
Exactly.
Okay, that's helpful. Great. Let's move on to the second part of the question, why are there so few senior women in European tech? And I think for that, Vaso, you're going to walk us through some additional data that might shed some light on the conversation. So I'm just going to flip to that.
Yeah. Okay, great. Thank you. So in this slide, we see how the prospect of starting and raising a family influences women and their careers specifically. And, I think we can comfortably still argue that women somewhat disproportionately still shoulder the burden and joy, I'm sure, of caring for children and raising their families. But some additional context that came out from the Ravio report was that, as you can see on the slide, around 80% of women voted that, they voted no to seeing that their family negatively impacted their career progression. However, 55% of women also answered yes to changing their career choices and goals since becoming a parent. And I think, so what we see on the right-hand side, what does this tell us? It tells us that it feels that women change their expectations and obviously their priorities once they start a family. And this might be the reason why they feel that they are less impacted in terms of career progression. It could also be because, bearing in mind that this report covers folks who work in tech. Traditionally, tech is seen as an industry and sector that is supportive of families. So it might be that the tech industry offers better parental support than more traditional companies. I think, Emma, you had thought that the second question here on the right was somewhat surprising. What do you think?
Yeah, I think when looking at the slides, it was about. Yeah, it was. I felt like it was initially quite surprising that people the number was fairly low around women thinking that their career progression had been negatively impacted. But I think when you overlay it with the second data point around the career choices and priorities, that's a useful piece of context for me as we went through, because I do think that is quite true within our business. Women tend to return from parental leave, and it can feel quite a journey to return to a role that you were doing previously. It takes you a while to get yourself settled back in. So it is something that we've seen within our business as well.
And maybe just to add where these numbers come from. So we surveyed about 250 people who work in the European tech ecosystem. And we're very confident that we've reached statistical significance with that sample size. So we feel pretty good about these results. And they're somewhat at odds with other data points. So for example, there's an external resource, which I think is excellent, which is called the Child Penalty Atlas. And this metric tries to understand or measure the impact that having a family, having a child, has on men and women's employment rates across the world. And you can see that in every single country, women are the ones that unsurprisingly take the short-term hit, but yet usually that decrease in employment rate persists over time. There's a slight recovery, but there's still a very big gap compared to men. So there's clearly a disconnect between the way that the female respondents of our surveys feel and what can actually be seen in reality. Now, obviously, caveat is that, as I've also mentioned, this is the tech industry in particular, where policies tend to be more supportive, more generous than just the statutory minimum. But I'd be surprised if someone was to do a child penalty atlas for the tech industry specifically if the numbers were wildly different and showed no impact on women. We also have another slide that you are going to talk us through, Vaso. So let me just move us over to that one.
Cool. Yeah, thanks. So here we look at perceptions and attitudes again amongst our, our respondents, and we see that perception matters. And let me talk you why. So 76% of women feel that they don't have equal opportunities for career and pay relative to their male colleagues, and you can see this on the right hand side. Now, those who are eagle-eyed will spot that on the left hand side, where we asked a more macro and generalized question. So, do you think women in your company have equal opportunities for pay and progression compared to men? The same number of people voted yes. So here we see a complete disconnect between the generalized question, women in company, yes, they do have equal opportunities, versus the personal question, do you feel your views, opinions, concerns, and suggestions are equally listened to? Where we see no. So here we can see that overwhelmingly a majority of women feel that they're not equally listened to and feel less influential, which we'll look at in the next slide. So all of this to say that perception of how opportunities are granted in an organization are really really important, but may still be at odds with a personal experience.
And I think it's great if we just move on to the next slide as well, because they both ladder up to us taking a look under the hood at Zoopla, and Emma shedding a little bit of light on what Zoopla is doing to address some of these issues that we're unpacking here. So let me just do that. And I think, Vasu, you're going to walk us through this one too, right?
Yeah, exactly. So here we just look in a little bit more detail in what some of those factors that influence how women feel in the organization and what their personal lived experience might look like. So it's reported that female employees may find it harder than their male colleagues and peers to feel like their voice is getting heard, or that they're able to really influence and move a conversation, whether it's at like a team level or on a personal level. So you can see that in answer to the question, do you feel your views, opinions, concerns, and suggestions are equally listened to by your team as your male colleagues? 68% voted no. And in terms of equal ability to influence decisions as your male colleagues, 80% voted no as well. Some of us have been really lucky to work with amazing male allies who are very aware of this lived experience and will sort of help women both get heard, but also progress. But it's obvious that there's still a lot of progress that needs to be made so that the overall environment feels more equal for women.
So with that, I think I'm going to hand it over to you, Emma. But maybe just to summarize, so we just are trying to unpick, what are factors that might be contributing to, especially senior women having a drop-off rate. So it's not seeing a very high proportion of senior women in tech organizations compared to their male peers. And we talked about the impact that having a family has on women, which obviously tends to happen later in life, and hence might explain why there's a drop-off from the junior and mid levels to the senior level. Then we talked about the perceptions that women have about their career opportunities compared to their peers. And now we can see here that a very high proportion of the female respondents of our survey actually do not feel like they have the ability to influence decisions, and they also don't feel necessarily listened to in line with their male peers. So that is a nice segue to understanding or looking a little bit at what Zoopla has done to address some of these issues. And I'm just going to hand it over to you, Emma.
Brilliant, thank you. Yeah, some of the initiatives I've mentioned. So if we think about kind of at the starting point of an employee journey, the candidate pipeline, as I mentioned, we partner with TechSheCan, which really enables us to develop young talent coming into the tech space. We really focused in the last couple of years on our benefits and policies offering to ensure that it is attractive, it is diverse, it offers a varied range of policies to support parental leave, flexibility, remote working, work from anywhere, kind of packaging it all up to ensure that people returning to work, people within the business that have got kind of caring responsibility, families, women in particular, returning from maternity leave, have got that all-rounded support from the business, and on the back of that, we're going to build on that to ensure that we train our managers in some of these areas a little bit further, to ensure that they are enabled to have the really robust, supportive conversations. When we talk about perception, I would say from our perspective, I think over the last few years, there's been a perception that, and some of it is a reality, and it's backed up by data around, we have senior men, lots of men in senior roles across the business. We've worked really hard on that, in that we've introduced two separate initiatives. One is a senior leadership development program, so ensuring that they are they're supported in their career development, and they've got the opportunity to experience different areas of the business. So not only development within their own particular team or a particular function, but actually they'll spending time with commercial function, finance function, across the business, so that we've got that all-rounded development, and that's been working really, really well. And then touching on where we do have our promotion process, ensuring that we have a diverse panel on our promotion panel, and actually having managers submitting very clear business cases, which has clear criteria linked to our career frameworks, so that it's very but it's based on data, it's based on information that's been supported by the manager, and feedback, so that it's a really robust performance and development kind of promotion and conversation. So it's really clear on that. So they're the key things that we've been working on. It's trial and error with a lot of these things. You have to try them, start small, build up is what I always suggest. We take a lot of feedback from our business. We have engagement surveys, we have pulse surveys across different teams. So we use that as well to feed into the initiatives that we plan. But they're the key ones that we've been working on from a Zoopla perspective. Then to kind of build on that, the big piece that we are working on for the rest of the year is moving to pay transparency. So being really clear around our salary levels, from an internal and an external perspective, enabling employees to understand exactly where they sit within a salary level. So that gives that really clear transparency. And obviously that's where Ravio have been supporting us. We onboarded Ravio at the beginning of the year, and they've been, really, really integral in this development of our kind of, our benchmarking approach and our overall salary levels. And we aim to get to, hopefully to get to pay transparency at some point of early 2025.
I'd love to unpick a little bit the first part of what you mentioned. So you said there is a lot of support for women that return after having a child. What does that look like at the more granular level?
Yeah, sure. It's maternity coaching. So a number of sessions with a maternity coach. So talking about how you might tailor your return to work, talking about what it is you're going to need support with, understanding the challenges you might face, kind of talking them through, having somebody to coach. And we offer 3 sessions at an appropriate time for the individual returning. We're also in the process of launching, maternity buddies, so that somebody that's already gone through maternity leave within Zoopla will be on hand to provide support and guidance. We've got a managers program where a manager's kind of got clear kind of guidelines around communication, around kind of supporting that individual coming back into the workspace, how much to kind of plan an induction versus, getting them kind of, back in from a social environment, planning a lunch versus after work drinks, because that might not quite work. And so just really clear guidance around, that support that women need when they come back.
And are there any initiatives that you haven't rolled out yet for parental leave in general, whether that's for the birthing parent or the non-birthing parent, that you're very keen to try?
To be honest, I think we're still looking at the initiative we've got around kind of the buddy and the induction planning, that we want to see if that's successful. Once we've looked at the data of that, then we will be looking at different opportunities. But at the moment, we're still trying to ensure that what we're doing is working and working effectively. So gathering feedback on that.
I will add here just two suggestions that have worked really well for me in the past. One is for the return of the birthing parent. If possible, having a sort of re-onboarding period whereby the birthing parent is paid, full pay, but work, 4 out of 5 days of the week, or 9 days out of 10 working days for a 2-3 month period, whatever that might be. Obviously, it's a benefit that costs, but has got amazing feedback that has helped people just readjust to a working life after a huge life event. And the second, really small but tactical thing is sort of offering, food delivery vouchers to new parents, whether that's Deliveroo or a competitor. It is the single-hand most popular benefit that I have ever offered, and it still blows me away. But apparently, food delivery is very helpful for new-ish parents.
Love that idea. That's fantastic.
There's one more initiative that I think is sometimes overlooked. Obviously, I'm biased because I'm a man, but I think too many companies only focus on parental leave for women, birthing parent. But actually, I recently read a report that shows some pretty clear evidence from Scandinavia that for every month of non-birthing parent leave, usually paternity leave, there is a substantial increase in the pay rate of women a couple of years after they give birth. And that might seem counterintuitive at first, but actually if you think it through, it does make sense because it levels the playing field a little bit. Women have no choice but to be off of work for a couple of months, sometimes a year or longer, right? Because they're the ones who are having the child. Whereas men, in many countries, they're off for a week or two and then they're back to work. So they're not missing out on any opportunities to get promoted, to prove themselves in their jobs. Whereas women just face that gap that will, unless there are some crazy medical advances, will never disappear. And therefore, offering a longer period of parental leave can actually contribute towards creating a more level playing field, especially if it is also encouraged for men to take it. But obviously, I say that as a man, I do value that time, and I did when I had my child. But I think it's something that also deserves some attention in many companies.
Yeah, it's interesting you mentioned that, Merton, because it was something that we looked at enhancing, and we did enhance our parental leave about 18 months ago. And actually for those reasons, to kind of, lessen the burden and kind of enhance the opportunity for females. And it was very well received by our male counterparts. So yeah, I agree.
That is also very generous policy compared to what we often see in the market, especially in the UK. Great. We have some questions from the audience, and I would say please keep them coming so we can move to our Q&A. The first question goes to you, Emma. So when talking about pay transparency, do you start with each employee seeing their own salary range, or all within the job profile, or even the entire company? So maybe talk us through how that is intended to work.
Really, really, really good question. And we're not entirely sure yet, if I'm honest, because I think this is such a sensitive subject. I think what we will start with, salary levels by profile. And then, we will test it with managers. We will test it with a small population of certain teams. we'll move to, salary levels by profile. Eventually, I would like us to get there, but I think it will be a journey to get to that point.
What do you think are the biggest hurdle in that journey?
I think it's two things. I think people want this information, but actually when it's reality, that may mean that they are not within the salary level, or they may have a perception of where they sit within the business, which might not be actually realistic. So I think there's that part. I think we as a business have a number of legacy issues from a pay perspective that we need to address. So I think that's going to be one of the biggest challenges. If we could wipe it out and start again, it'd be a lot easier.
That is something that we often hear at Ravio, which is it is so hard to retrofit pay transparency onto larger, more mature organizations. It is much easier to do that from the beginning, but obviously at the very beginning of a company's journey, there's so many other priorities. You're just trying to actually prove that your business has a right to exist, that this is often not a priority, which is, I think, why it's quite instrumental to have strong people within the HR people teams, because they can build those foundations from very early on.
Yeah, that would be my one suggestion for anybody that's in a startup scale up, is even if you do not socialize your job framework, your profiles, your salary levels, and you have them from an internal people perspective, you've got a really good foundation for what you can then build on. And then you can bring, managers and employees into that at the right time. But you make sure that you've got the consistent framework, you're starting on a much more even playing field. It's much easier than trying to unpick and change profiles and change job families and unpick a framework that's not really understood.
Yeah. We also had one question, one comment on how we calculate the adjusted versus unadjusted pay gap. So Isaiah just did a great job. Thank you for outlining exactly how this typically works at later stage companies that have a lot of data available. So typically they would hire consultants, unless they have the in-house capabilities, to run a regression analysis that effectively look at every single factor that might explain a difference in pay between men and women. Now, the reason why we didn't do that is A, because we can't do that for 1,000 companies, because we just don't have 100% of that data available. But B, we also think that taking job level as a proxy is potentially an even better starting point for the purpose of understanding whether people are receiving equal pay for equal work, because job level is the number one thing that companies determine for having jobs of the same value, right? So unless companies have an imperfect leveling system, if they put two people that perform the same job at the same level, the expectation is that these two people will contribute similar value to the organization. And that's why we took it as a proxy to run our adjusted versus unadjusted pay analysis. But yes, obviously, if anyone wants to really understand at their organization level what might be factors that are contributing to this pay gap so that they can then address them, such as, for example, age, which is often a factor, or years of experience, then that would require a proper regression analysis. Cool. I think we are exactly at time. I'd love to keep the questions going, but I also know that all of you probably have very busy work schedules ahead of you. So first and foremost, thank you to Emma and Vaso for taking the time to shed some light on some of the issues that we're seeing in the industry. And then second of all, thank you to all of you who listened in and were with us for the entire hour and for being a very engaged audience. Really appreciate that. And we already look forward to the next one. Thank you very much, everyone.
Thank you.